final section is to actually break it down into proofs. Here's an argument that shows, here's a series of arguments that actually shows that demolition is the only plausible explanation. The first one is just to look at the pulverization of the concrete. What you see in the case of both buildings is this intense pulverization, this white clouds of concrete. These are clouds of concrete and gypsum. And by the distribution, by the opacity of these clouds as they're being ejected, by the distribution of mass around these buildings, I mean, they didn't just fall straight down on the footprints. They radiated out all over the place, and probably just a small fraction of the mass was within the actual footprints of the buildings. And especially the concrete, which is just all over the streets. Apparently, virtually all the concrete in these buildings was thoroughly pulverized. There's 4-inch thick concrete floor slabs on every floor in the 110 floors of each of these towers, and there's no evidence of any macroscopic chunks of concrete at ground zero. I mean, you can scour the images, and all you see is dust and chunks of steel. So this is entirely counterintuitive, because if you were to take a concrete block and drop it from, say, the roof of the tower, I'm sure it would smash into a lot of small pieces, but it wouldn't turn into microscopic powder, where the particles are less than 100 microns in diameter. But you need a lot of, explosive energy applied consistently throughout the building to achieve that. This proof, I think, is the one that I think most people get. And this has to do with looking at the way the building came down and the rate at which it came down, but specifically at which the rates of different parts of the rubble came down. So if you were to drop a brick off the roof of the tower in a vacuum, it would take 9.2 seconds to reach the ground. The towers came down completely in 13 to 16 seconds. So by 16 seconds, everything is down. So that's only about 50% longer than gravitational free fall. And that's true of all the stuff that's falling through the air. So the only thing that's slowing down all this stuff outside the profile of the building is air. So the air is slowing things down by, say, 30 to 50 to 60%. But if you look at the inside of the profile of the building, everything's coming down in here, too, at the same rate. Well, but wait a minute. This is falling freely through the air, and it's 100 feet out from the building. It's been falling for a long time. It's falling freely through the air, and even big chunks of steel are falling at this rate, being slowed down only by air. But here, inside the building, remember, all this mass of the building is supposedly crushing itself, but yet it's coming down at the same rate as the rubble falling through the air. So the non sequitur here is, to believe the official story, you have to believe that all this intact, cold, incredibly strong steel structure that was so strong it can hold this building up in a horizontal crosswind of 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour, and yet the building is providing all that steel structure is providing no more resistance to falling rubble than air is. So it's it's just ludicrous to think that this steel structure would just be crumbling, just self-destructing. That's what it would have to be. It would have to be a self-destructing building. There's another proof that's much more complicated. It has to do with just looking at the energy requirements needed to expand the dust clouds. Because if you look at, there's photographs that show the development of these dust clouds, and this one is 30 seconds after the start of the North Tower collapse. And I do a precise estimate, or not that precise, but I look at the reference points in the dust cloud, and make an estimate. And this cloud by 30 seconds is about 5 times the volume of the building. And there's 2 main ways that can happen. One is that the turbulence can increase the size of the dust cloud, but to the extent that can't, then all the rest of the expansion has to be provided thermally, by thermal energy evaporating moisture and by just causing thermodynamic expansion. And I come up with an estimate for the total energy requirements of the expansion just to the dust cloud that's well over 10 times the entire elevated mass of the building. That's the gravitational potential energy that is supposedly driving all this destruction. Doesn't even come close to satisfying this energy sink, let alone all those other energy sinks like crushing all that concrete, which would also probably require a lot more than the total mass of the building. And the final proof, and this one I think is also fairly easy to understand, has to do with looking at the way that the top of the South Tower came down. Now it first started at a tilt, but what you see if you look at it carefully is that it starts to tilt, but right at about this point, the tilting stops as it's going into the dust cloud and actually starts to right itself. That contradicts the law of conservation of angular momentum, barring demolition, because the fulcrum would have been causing it to rotate faster. So the only explanation is that the entire top of the building has been shredded, presumably by demolition, and that's what caused it to stop rotating, because the moment of inertia was destroyed. so the conclusion of this is that looking at the physical evidence, at showing the features of demolition, proofs of demolition, and as well as, of course, the total bankruptcy of the official explanations and the fraudulence of the official investigations, leads me to conclude unequivocally that the Twin Towers and Building 7 were all deliberately destroyed through controlled demolition that was not a result of the plane crashes and fires.
And in the last several minutes of my presentation to you, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to consider what we are about altogether in terms of our standing here, our intention, our moral calling. There have been several fine individuals who have come forward over the last 18 months and have asked people to consider what they should do as citizens of the world. And I think we're not only U.S. citizens in this grand jury, in this proceedings, we are citizens of the world. And we need to examine what has happened to our United States through its manipulation by the very financiers we can see as profiting most integrally from the terrible crimes of 9/11/01 and the even more terrible crimes that ensued from the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. We really have to look at the very center of the world we inhabit. And I think that is the truly happy and liberating aspect of our task, because once we begin to see to the bottom of 9/11/01, we can really begin to consider alternatives that are there for us in terms of changing our way of life and somehow combating the situations that we're put in. Because I think 9/11/01 was evidence of the entire desperation of the economic system we inhabit. If you look at the amounts of debt that have been contracted by the world's leading financial institutions, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, the trillions of dollars that they hold in liabilities from derivatives, you'll see that they can only go from one act of terror, one war to the next in order to sustain themselves. And they can only sustain themselves through sacrificing us on days like 9/11/01, when more than 2,000 innocent people perished in the fall of those towers, sacrificing us in deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. servicemen, and more importantly, to me, sacrificing so many more thousands and millions of the world's people to sustain their basically irrational and destructive economic engine.